Thanks for coming and being here.
Good to see you. Hello, everybody. Oh, my God.
Fellows in the audience.
Hey, y'all.
So let me know when.
Oh, they must be from other.
Okay. Hello, everybody. All right, we can do a little bit better than that. Hello. Thank you. Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Ann Mosle. I'm a vice president here at the Aspen Institute and the founding executive director of Ascend at the Aspen Institute and co-chair of the Aspen Forum on Women and Girls. But most importantly, I am someone who really had to take a step back after the past 3.5 years. They were challenging, and they profoundly challenged me. Looking at the loss of life, humanity, polarizations, divides, racial injustice and reckoning or lack of reckoning, of places and spaces where people can come together, where they come and can celebrate diversity and difference, but also create paths forward where every child, every person, every family, every community can be safe, secure, and thriving. So this tonight is a little bit, we're going to jump in just a minute, was about creating space for conversations that matter, opportunities to be curious, humble, have introspection, get fortified, but then also think about the connections and the insights that will drive towards greater individual and collective impact. 2024 is going to be an amazing year. Each presidential opportunity is more amazing than the last. It is a time typically for a country to have a conversation. And so this conversation with these two amazing gentlemen, I couldn't be more excited to have you all join me to be a part of it. And so I want to say thank you to all of you who've made the trip to come here tonight. I also want to thank you and say hello to the 500 or more people who registered virtually from more than 40 states across this country. Strong Georgia turnout.
Oh, wow. Good.
We also have representation from Rwanda and Cote d'Ivoire and perhaps other places across the country. Thinking about freedom, economic opportunity, liberation, possibility, and joy is a global conversation, it is a national conversation, and it is a personal right. So for here tonight, this is a chance for us to sort of hear from two very intentionally designed leaders being in the same room. U.S. Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock.
Thank you.
Needs no introduction, but is an extraordinary leader in the faith community, from Abyssinian, Douglas Memorial Community in Baltimore, to the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. He is an author of multiple books. He is a phenomenal father, friend, and Aspen Institute Ascend Fellow. He's family here. And when he was elected, it was not just a historic moment. It was a heart-swelling moment. It was a moment of hope. He is transcendent in the U.S. Senate. So Raphael, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
We are so honored and thrilled to have Jonathan Ige here. Jonathan, you'll become family by the end of the evening. Jonathan is an exceptionally talented, best-selling author of 6 books. His most recent one that we are here to really have a chance to learn from and pull out the lessons, King a Life. New York Times best-selling, insert the other publications best-selling in places. I can promise you, it is a great, big read. Need to read it. Obama, President Obama and Mrs. Obama, top picks. This is a book to read. Also, 2 of my other favorites, an incredible biography on Lou Gehrig and Muhammad Ali. But he is a journalist and a biographer that helps us make sense of history so that we can really embrace the future. So no better way to kick off, if we may, is, Jonathan, I'll start with you. You know, there's been so many books about Martin Luther King. Why this one? Why now? Why you?
I don't know about why me, but I know about why Dr. King. And that's because over the last 40 years or so, certainly since we made a national holiday and built a national monument, we've lost sight of him as a human being. And when I was working on my Ali book and interviewing people like Dick Gregory and John Lewis and Harry Belafonte, realizing that these people knew Dr. King, knew him well. Like Belafonte told you about kicking off their shoes and sitting on the floor and listening to records together. And I just thought, wow, there's an opportunity to write a book that presents him as a human being again, as well as the great activist and preacher that we know, but to take him out of that stone monument and make him flesh for readers again, I thought would be the best possible use of my time. And just selfishly, I thought, wow, if I could spend the next 6 years of my life interviewing the people who knew and worked with King, what better activity could there be for me personally? How could I possibly learn more than that? So I really set out not only to write a book that treated him as a human being again, but also reminded us that he was a radical. Because in the process of canonizing him and sanctifying him, we've made him a safer figure. And we've forgotten that there was a first half to the I Have a Dream speech. And that first half of the speech talked about things like police brutality and the debt that had still not been paid for the people who'd been enslaved in this country. And I wanted to write a book that not only, that did both of those things, that showed the true radical and the real man.
Yes, well done. And we're going to come back to go deeper on that in a second. And Raphael, just to kind of get us kicked off in center, what, from your special connection, what does Dr. Martin Luther King mean for you?
Oh, wow, that's a big question.
I know.
And
I'm asking a Reverend.
Well, thank you so much. And how much time do you have?
This is a kickoff.
But it's great to be here. It's always good to be at Aspen. Dr. King has been, outside of my parents, my singular most inspiring, influential human being. And Jonathan talks about what has happened over the last nearly 40 years and the canonization of Dr. King. Well, I was a part of that generation of kids whose parents were fighting to create the holiday. And even before we had the national holiday in 1986, my parents were among those who literally pulled us out of school on Dr. King's birthday. We weren't going to wait on the government to catch up. And I spent every January 15th or somewhere thereabout at the local May Street YMCA watching Eyes on the Prize, that old black and white film, listening to Dr. King's speeches. And he absolutely captured my imagination. His ability to motivate people. He was a kind of a word magician who then put those words into practice, laid his body on the line, and inspired others to do it and convinced them that they could actually change. My parents were both Pentecostal preachers, and so I was, very thoughtful in their way and engaged, but I said, that's what I want to do with my life. Yeah. And the ways in which he used his faith, not as a weapon, but as a bridge. Yeah. And that's inspired me my entire life. I was born a year after Dr. King's death, but he recruited me to Morehouse College. I went to Morehouse because I just wanted to be on the campus where he matriculated and was inspired. I didn't know I'd become the pastor of the church.
Yeah. We'll talk more about that. So Jonathan, you really did flip the script. A lot of books had sort of the big movement or historical picture, and you flipped it through the life of a man. And just when you read it, the weight, the courage. Share with the audience some of the parts for you that are sort of the strongest or most important insights about how King led, but how he also led as a human.
Well, it's important to remember that he didn't seek to be the leader of a movement. Right. He wanted to be a pastor, he wanted to be a priest, and maybe someday teach.
Yep.
And that was it. But I think it became an extension of his ministry that he felt like he had to get involved, because here he is, he's 26 years old. He's got a new church and a new baby at home in Montgomery, and this bus boycott thing starts, right? And they're looking for somebody to speak to the crowd. They're not looking for somebody to lead the Montgomery Improvement Association and become the national leader of a civil rights movement. They're just looking for somebody who'll speak to the crowd on day one. Mm-hmm. And they pick this kid, Martin Luther King Jr., because he's new in town and he hasn't made any enemies yet. And he's got a reputation for being a pretty good speaker, And he gets up there, and he doesn't want to do it at first. He agrees reluctantly. At first, he doesn't even want to go to the meeting. Mm-hmm. But he agrees to speak, and he finds this voice that is a part of everything Reverend Warnock was just talking about growing up in the church, about going to Morehouse. He says to this crowd on December 5th, 1955, spontaneously, he had no time to prepare, right. He says, it just might turn out that it's the people who've been treated worst by this country, the formerly enslaved, the second-class citizens who are going to make democracy live up to its promises. Mm-hmm. And if we're wrong in demanding justice, if we're wrong in demanding equality, then the Constitution is wrong, and the Bible is wrong, and God Almighty is wrong. And it's a message that comes from who he is, mm-hmm. what's baked into him from his father, who was the preacher, whose grandfather was a preacher, both at Ebenezer. But it's a message that's so hard to refute because he's calling on things that most of us can agree with. And I think that's where the man becomes the leader, not because he had ambitions to lead, not because he wanted power or fame, but because it was just, that's who he was as a human being, and it comes from his faith more than anything else.
Yeah. Well, I'm digging a little bit deeper on that, because as the years went by, as the thousands of miles that he traversed and the colonies kept coming, he faced pressures within the movement, too conservative, too moderate, too radical, the force of the FBI, of the police, the systems of power. Tell us about your work in that area, about his leadership, his experience as a human, but that also how he navigated it so selflessly, but majestically.
Well, to quote Reverend Warnock, how much time do I have? This is one of the great challenges of the King's story. And one of the great ironies is that we can better understand his plight and the emotional toll this took on him because our government was tapping his phones, surveilling him, planting bugs in his hotel rooms. That's how we know how much King suffered for his faith, for his belief that we could be a better country. Our country, the government that now created a national holiday, was trying to destroy him, to undermine his work, and to break up the civil rights movement. And there's this just terrible irony, and it's painful to me to read these transcripts, because we have the transcripts of thousands of his private phone calls, his personal phone calls, and we can read how troubled he is, how sad he is, how lonely he is at times, and how frustrated he is that, especially in the last 3 or 4 years of his life, that it feels like no one's listening to him anymore. And there's this one phone call. It was after what may have been his greatest speech. Some people, I would probably vote for it as my favorite speech, the Riverside Church speech on April 4th, 1967, exactly a year before his assassination, where he really sums up his entire philosophy and talks about how he can't limit himself to speaking out only on segregation. He can't limit himself to speaking out only on voting rights. He has to speak out on war, on materialism, because it would be hypocritical to everything he believed if he didn't speak out on those issues. And the day after that, one of his best friends calls him, one of his closest advisors, and says, I didn't like that speech. And we can read the transcript. These are King's words, and his closest friend is saying, that speech is going to hurt us. It's going to set back our fundraising with Northern liberals. It's going to damage our relationship with the White House. It's going to damage our relationship in Congress. And we should really just be focused on voting rights. And King, to one of his best friends, and we have the transcript, again, thank you, FBI, King says, don't you know who I am? Haven't you been listening to anything I've been saying all these years? What I said might not have been politically wise, but it was morally correct. And he's a moral leader.
Yes.
And the world just doesn't know how to handle that.
Yeah. Well, the world I mean, you live in those crosshairs, Reverend Warnock, and I'm curious, for you, when you think about King's strength and pain and navigating through that complexity, what are the lessons that stay with you?
Well, you know, one of the things I'm struck by in hearing Jonathan describe this again, and like I've spent my entire life as a devotee of Dr. King and what he represented, I'm really struck by the integrity of his ministry and his public witness, and his willingness just to go all out. There's a kind of, he was an imperfect human being, but there's a kind of integrity about his ministry and his leadership that we sorely need in this moment. Dr. King said we need leaders not in love with money, but in love with justice. Mm-hmm. Not in love with publicity, but in love with humanity. Leaders who will subjugate their own egos, he said, to the great cause of freedom. And, you know, I work in that little building up the street. And part of the problem in our public life right now is that the politics has become about the politicians. Mm-hmm. Who's in, who's out, who's up, who's down. And I think ordinary people are saying, who cares? Mm-hmm. Like, we don't wake up thinking about the politicians' problems. You're supposed to be working on ours. And Dr. King was just selfless. He gave himself over to the movement. And all of that was grounded in his faith. You know, there's the text in the New Testament, you got a preacher, so you're going to hear some scripture.
This is good. This is good.
You know, that if you seek, Jesus said, to save your life, you'll lose it. Mm-hmm. But if you give your life over for my sake, you'll find eternal life. And that may sound very ethereal, but whether you're in the faith tradition or not, the sense that you give your life over to something larger than you might actually find yourself in the process. And so he did this at great cost, but all of us are the beneficiaries of that. And it inspires me every single day.
Well, and it's when I think about conversations we've had together and with many of you in this room, the letter from Birmingham City Jail is a seminal text here at the Aspen Institute. And I think back when I was reading and moderating that 10, 12 years ago, even as a kid, and it just almost feels like today, just as clearly and as sort of in my body. And so that fortitude is very powerful. And so this piece from, going back to some of the history, Jonathan, at that time, that speech wasn't quite as powerful as it is. I mean, it's in the ether. But as he pushed through and kind of went from the civil rights and the voting and the racial justice focus, talk more about as he kind of broadened out to kind of really going into sort of shifting from economic reform. There's a war of poverty kind of happening in the backdrop, 60-year mark on that. But really you're talking about economic and human rights revolution.
Yeah, we have this perception, this is another thing I wanted to correct in the book, is we have this perception that King in the last year or two of his life became more radical. Mm-hmm. And I say he was radical all along. He just didn't really or people weren't willing to listen. Mm-hmm. But when he was raising money for the Montgomery bus boycott and for St. Augustine and Albany, Georgia, and Birmingham, and traveling to the north and speaking at churches and synagogues and anywhere he could be heard, he was calling out the Northern racism when he was there in 57, 58.
Yeah.
He was calling it out. He was saying that, yes, we're working in Birmingham right now, but don't forget what's going on in your own backyard. It's just that the Northern media didn't want to write about it as much because it's much easier to write about Bull Connor.
Yeah.
But King was calling it out all along. And then, after you see the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, he begins to feel like, A, he's got more bandwidth. He's also got a Nobel Peace Prize behind him. And it's really Coretta, who, when he wins the Nobel Peace Prize, who says, we have a greater responsibility than ever now.
Yeah.
And she says, we have to start speaking out on issues beyond civil rights, talking about human rights. We have to speak out on war. We have to speak out on poverty and hunger. And that's when you really see him, again, against the wishes of his advisors, even the people who helped educate him as a radical, people like Bayard Rustin and Stan Levison and Ella Baker. These are the people who are now telling him, whoa, hold on. Why don't we just stick to what we're good at?
Yeah.
And King is saying, no, that's not what I'm here for. And that's when he begins going to Chicago, moves into my hometown. That's when he goes to Los Angeles, when everybody's saying, don't go, but he has to go because he's a moral leader. He's not doing what's most practical.
Yeah. Share more about the impact of the Nobel Peace Prize. And I'm also curious about the impact it had on LBJ and Hoover.
Well, it infuriated Hoover in particular, and LBJ too. One of the other things that I think we have to recognize here, it's easy to blame all of it on J. Edgar Hoover, and we should blame a lot of it on J. Edgar Hoover. But
Sullivan.
J. Edgar Hoover and not just the FBI, not just William Sullivan and the other officials within the FBI, but they are getting support from, first of all, the Kennedy administration, and then even more support from the Johnson administration. And one of the things I discovered, and this is a shout out to David Garrow, who wrote one of the other outstanding, seminal books on King. He said, have you thought about checking Mildred Stiegel's file? She was the secretary to LBJ, and she kept a safe in her office with the most important documents, including the tapes that LBJ made from the White House. And in those files were thousands of pages of memos directly from J. Edgar Hoover to LBJ, all about King's personal life. Intel, basically, like he's speaking here this week. He's working on an article for the New Yorker, for the Atlantic. He's attending an anti-war rally here. But also the details of his personal life, about what hotels he's staying at, who he's with. And LBJ is not just a passive recipient of this. He's encouraging J. Edgar Hoover to leak this to the press. And it is being leaked to the press. And while the media didn't report on King's personal life,
They really kind of rejected it.
they also didn't report on the fact that the FBI was surveilling private citizens.
Yeah.
And it affected King's coverage because all these reporters and editors knew or thought that he was a hypocrite. So it affects, and he can't understand why he's being bashed in the media for speaking out against Vietnam. And it's in part because the water has been tainted. So the FBI's role in this is huge, and it has not just national political consequences, it has personal consequences for King.
Huge, huge. So Raphael, you sit in the world of inside outside, or if you just want to jump respond.
Well, I just wanted to think about the fact that this man didn't hold any political office. He's a preacher.
Yeah.
Right.
Down in Atlanta. And the establishment is so frightened, terrified by him that they are using all of the resources of the government of the greatest country on the planet to destroy a private citizen, and literally tried to drive him to commit suicide. Yeah. And through all of that, we hear the power of his voice, even in the midst of all of this personal struggle. These issues are relevant now around surveillance. Yeah. In fact, some of us have got some decisions to make right now about bills that are being offered, and the power and the ability to do that is exponential to what Dr. King, faced. All of us are walking around here with these phones, and they're tracing us and our steps in all kinds of ways that we ought to be very, very concerned about. So these issues are very, very relevant. And again, in those times, it was the threat of communism.
Yeah.
And then what we saw in the wake of the war on terror was the reach and the overreach of government to keep us all safe.
Yeah.
And we ought to always be wary of the folks who say they're keeping us safe. And the question is, at what cost?
Absolutely, the good old law and order. Order for who?
Yeah.
So you're now on the inside of government, and in community, and a man of faith. You know, how are you leading? How are you leaning on King, others? There are very few people asking the questions, probing the accountability right now.
Well, I try to stay connected to my friends who've known me long before I was a senator, because they'll tell me the truth.
Yep. Amen.
And no matter what you do, you ought to stay connected to folks who knew you and who were close enough to challenge you and push you and encourage you. Look, I'm deeply honored to represent the people of Georgia in the United States Senate. It's a real honor for the people of your state to say that when we take stock of what we want for our future, when we think about our children, when we think about our parents as they face the burdens and the blessings of aging, as we think about the future of the planet itself, since all of us can't go to Washington, we're going to send you. And we're going to trust that in the rooms of power, you're going to be thinking about us. You're going to try to do the right thing. Doesn't mean you're always going to get it right, but you're going to be guided by what's right for all of us. And for me, that's an honor, and it's what I hope keeps me grounded. Yeah. Dr. King, for example, said that of all the injustices, he said, inequality in healthcare is the most shocking and the most inhumane. And so I've been preaching for years about healthcare. Long before I went to the Senate, I was trying to get my state of Georgia to expand Medicaid, to stop waging war against the Affordable Care Act. And now as a senator, I get to fight for that in a different kind of way. I literally put billions of dollars in the American Rescue Plan to further incentivize Georgia to do what it should have done years ago and expand Medicaid, get 600,000 Georgians out of the health care coverage gap. Pushing, still haven't gotten that done, but I did write a bill that capped the cost of insulin to $35 out-of-pocket cost per month for seniors, and I'm trying to get that done for everybody, because insulin shouldn't be expensive, and the work of Dr. King inspires me every single day.
Well, one last question, going a little bit deeper with you, Reverend Warnock. Go back to 2005. It's Father's Day. It's Juneteenth. Your life's about to change, and you gave a pretty powerful interview sermon, that power on the mountain and pain in the valley. Does that ring a bell?
You remember my sermons better than me. Yeah, I do remember that sermon.
Yeah, think about, Reverend Warnock at that time, which was when he was invited to come down at what, 35?
Yeah, I was 35 years old, and I was the final candidate for the pastorate of Ebenezer Baptist Church. And they invited me down to preach that Sunday. And yeah, the sermon was the power on the mountain and the pain in the valley. And connecting those two things, connecting our spirituality to practice, so that worship isn't just some exercise we do on Sunday morning to feel good, but then we leave out and that inspires our work. And it's something that I said when I launched my campaign, that I've never believed that faith stops at the church door. That's where it starts. And it ought to come alive in the work that we do and the public policy that we try to advance and the struggles that we get engaged in. And so yeah, I even in these difficult times, I feel incredibly blessed, like I'm living the dream. I get to preach about healthcare and humanity on Sunday, and then get on a plane on Monday and try to write laws and encourage and nudge my colleagues to push forward laws to make the word come alive and become flesh. And it's a grand tradition. Dr. King wasn't looking to lead a movement, but he does come out of a movement tradition, a moral tradition. We know that he pushed forward the Voting Rights Act in 1965, but Daddy King led a voting rights campaign in Atlanta in 1935. I mean, think about that. In the heart of Jim Crow South, in the 30s, when you could have been lynched for much less, there was Dr. King, pastor of Daddy King, Martin Luther King Sr., leading a voting rights campaign. And then his grandfather, his maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams, there have only been 5 pastors at Ebenezer, founded in 1886. I'm number 5. And A.D. Williams pushed forward a bond referendum to get the first public school for black kids in the 1920s. Dr. King had a high school to attend because of the activism of Ebenezer's second pastor, his maternal grandfather. So he does come out of the black social gospel tradition. He comes out of a tradition where, for decades, before there was a civil rights movement, there was people of faith in the basements and the sanctuaries of black churches working out the faith and trying to figure out how to challenge the nation to be better. And so I think it's important to emphasize that he is a genius, but he's not a singular genius. He emerges out of a tradition.
Absolutely.
That's rooted in the slaves who sang the spirituals, who said, I got shoes, you got shoes, all of God's children got shoes. When I get to heaven, I'm going to put on my shoes, shout all over God's heaven. That wasn't just some eschatological vision on the other side of history. It was a critique of the current conditions. Second line of that song said, everybody talking about heaven, looked at the slave master, ain't a going there. And he comes out of that tradition.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we're going to move into questions and conversation in a moment. One of the parts when I was going back to that sermon and that moment, it made me really think about when Reverend Lawson, for the second time, is really saying to Dr. King, we need you in Memphis.
Yeah.
Sanitation worker, protest, fight, strike. Talk to us there about King and that experience, why he went, the importance of him being there.
Here's another example of King rejecting the advice of his counselors and friends. And remember now, we're talking 1968. 70% of Americans disapprove of King.
Right.
That's 70% total. All Americans. Among white people, it's going to be a lot higher than that. And he's planning the Poor People's Campaign. He's beaten, he's tired, he's exhausted, he's feeling like no one's listening to him anymore, and he's planning the most ambitious campaign of his life. It's basically Occupy Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
He's going to bring thousands of people here, and they're going to camp out until the government agrees to fundamental economic reforms, guaranteed jobs, guaranteed income, guaranteed income, guaranteed jobs, among other things, health care. And it's not going well at all. He's having trouble, they want thousands, he's having trouble getting dozens of people to sign up for this. And then Jim Lawson calls and says, come to Memphis. And his advisors say, you can't go to Memphis. That's a local garbage workers strike. It's not important enough for you. We got bigger problems right here. King says, I have to go to Memphis. Because these are the people I'm talking about. The sanitation workers, they need me. And it's, again, not about what's practical, not about what's going to get him the most votes or support or help him in his polls. He's doing what's right morally. And he goes to Memphis, and it doesn't go well. The first march there ends in violence, and he feels like this is the worst thing that could possibly happen because he's so committed to nonviolent tactics. So he goes back to Memphis, and we know what happens when he goes back. And we know that the government, I want to just point out here that Reverend Warnock talked about the surveillance and the threat that King poses. When King begins planning the Poor People's Campaign, the FBI issues another memo that says,
thank you.
Malcolm X is dead. There's really no one else but Martin Luther King who might become the black messiah who really unites the black community. And we must do everything in our power to make sure that doesn't happen. We must undermine his work in any way we can. This is in February of 1968. And they send that memo out to every FBI bureau office. And King goes on. The FBI is releasing to the news what hotel he's staying at and what room he's in. And King goes on. And he gives this speech on the last night of his life and says, longevity is a nice thing. I'd like to live a long life, but that doesn't matter to me now. Because it's the cause, it's the mission. And I may not get to the promised land, but I have been to the mountaintop and I've seen the promised land, and I know that we together as a people will get there. Mm-hmm. That's why he's in Memphis, for the sanitation workers, and that's why he gives his life.
Yeah. Anything you want to share on that before we invite?
No, it's just a powerful moment, and you know, in closing, and nobody believes a preacher when he says in closing. It's as Jonathan says, it's a powerful moment. He takes this detour, goes to Memphis, and I just want to lift up the names Robert Walker and Echo Cole. Those were the sanitation workers who were killed. Their blood summoned Dr. King to Memphis. It was a fledgling local movement, but these two black sanitation workers were on the back of their truck. They were literally crushed by the machinery of their truck. Why were they there? Because it was a rainstorm. Their white colleagues could go inside the cab of the truck. They could not. And I'm emphasizing this because this is 1968. The civil rights law integrating public accommodations passed in 1964, voting rights law in 1965, and yet in 1968, these black workers were forced, because of segregation, to be on the backs of the truck in the first place, and their bodies were literally crushed by those trucks. And their blood summons Dr. King, a weary Dr. King. And the poor are still being crushed in many ways in our country. And there's a way in which we tell ourselves a simple story about the movement, that there was segregation, Dr. King had a dream, everybody got it, and now we've lived happily ever after. And it's much more complicated than that. It comes in fits and starts. We're in the midst of a huge backlash right now from those who want to erase this history. And this is why this kind of work and research is so important, so that we remain vigilant in doing the work to which he committed his life.
Raphael, what is the opportunity or hope that is driving you in this year ahead? And what's keeping you up at night? And how can we help for leaders like you?
Well, I think we are clearly at an inflection point. You know, and again, Dr. King reminded us that change doesn't roll in on the wheels of inevitability. He said the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. But his life demonstrates that we're the ones who have to bend that arc. And America is at another inflection point. Like all families, we have a complicated family story. There are these ideals that are laid out in the charter documents and the Declaration of Independence that Dr. King liked to recite in the Constitution. And then we've never lived up to that completely. But we keep pushing towards it. And we're in this moment. So I feel incredibly blessed to be alive today because we are the latest generation of Americans who gets to decide which way we're going to go. And right now, I'm worried about our democracy. That's what keeps me up at night. I don't want this election to be the last election as we've known it. And what inspires me is that I get to fight for it every single day, which is why I was trying to, I'll continue fighting till we pass voting rights, get this legislation over the finish line. And you know, the people who came before us didn't have any reason to think that they could win. So that's the other thing. I think
Love that.
I think we look back at the civil rights movement and as if the victories were inevitable. They were actually quite unlikely, and yet they soldiered on and with hope, and I remain hopeful. I can't help it. I got two little kids. They're 5 and 7, and I want to make sure that they inherit an America as good as its promise.
Yeah, right there with you. Okay, so we're going to do a couple short questions, and so I know Dr. Wendy Ellis is going to be the best role model to say name, organization, and a short question, because you can love on later, but because that way we can just bring more voices in. Because someone has to get on a plane and go home to Chloe and Caleb. So, Dr. Ellis.
Yes, name Dr. Wendy Ellis, Director of the Center for Community Resilience at George Washington University, and also fellow Aspen Ascend.
Same class.
Yes, same class, that's right. So, you know, this conversation is coming just after last month's issue of Atlantic Magazine, To Reconstruct a Nation. And it really highlighted from cover to cover this opportunity to look at history as prologue with regard to where we are right now in a third Reconstruction. And from a historian's perspective, where do we have the opportunity to get this right? And from a systems perspective, thinking about politics, where is the greatest opportunity that we can actually move the needle? It's not just about saving democracy, but it's also about moving the needle forward, because we don't want to just stay where we are. We have to continue to move forward. So in that context of both at the intersection of faith, politics, and history, what can we really do right now?
Great question.
Well, I would just say from a historical standpoint, as Reverend Warnock said a minute ago, we have to remember that these were not foregone conclusions. Dr. King didn't just rise from Montgomery and give the I Have a Dream speech and see this legislation passed. He did the hard work, and thousands of people, millions of people marching alongside him and registering voters did that hard work. And it was because they believed that change was possible. They believed that no matter, and if anybody had reason to lose hope, it was Dr. King, right? Government on his back, stabbed in the chest, home bombed, and Coretta too. Either one of them could have said, that's enough, we're out. But they did not lose hope, and I feel like that's the reminder for me from a historical standpoint, is that you can't succumb to this temptation of hopelessness that we can't do anything, because we, as again to quote the Reverend, we have to bend that arc of history.
Yeah. So we remain focused on systems. The thing that inspires me about this story is the power of ordinary people. You know, that the government would be so afraid of this Baptist preacher that they would engage in this. But I also think about Fannie Lou Hamer, who at the Democratic National Convention in 1964, LBJ wasn't so much afraid of King as he was of Fannie Lou Hamer, this Mississippi sharecropper. And he literally created a phony excuse for going on television to knock her off of the air because her voice was just that powerful. And so what I try to remind people is that your voice is more powerful than you think. And if we're going to see change, there are those of us who are working on it on the inside, but we need the folks on the outside pushing.
Selma, do you want to?
Hi, C. Mary James. I'm an entrepreneur, actually. My question is about legacy. So when you just talked about Fannie Lou Hamer, it made me think about how much each generation starts the fight for advocacy or starts the fight for civil rights almost from the start. And how do we ensure that we pass the baton on an interpersonal level? The way that Dr. King stood on the shoulders of his father and his grandfather, how do we ensure that we have those legacy conversations with the stories of the people in this room, with all the work that we're collectively doing?
Love that. That's a great question.
Well, it's the recognition that it is legacy, and that there are folk who were doing this work long before you showed up. So I am under no pretense that I'm starting from the start. I'm standing on the shoulders of folks who've done this work. Dr. King's life absolutely made a difference. And I push hard against folks who say nothing has changed or a whole lot has changed. When I was born, Georgia had 2 effective senators. They were effective, but they were both segregationists. And one of them said, "We love the Negro in his place." and his place is at the back door. Well, I sit in his seat. As a result of the work of Dr. King and others in the movement. And we just have to keep building on top of that. Everybody in this room ought to have a mentor and a mentee. There ought to be somebody who pours into you. You ought to be pouring into other folk and keeping that movement going.
And Marie, I would also love to add to that, because when I think about one of the brightest spots is there's actually an abundance of leadership. There is leadership everywhere. There is leadership in every person in this room. And Marie, what you're putting out to, I think, is when I think about the leadership work we and I do, it's creating the conditions for that to be seen, poured into, lifted up, but it also is about and really the power within and the power around. And I think that's a beautiful question, and I think that's one of the things that across the Aspen Institute, that is something that, to the best of our abilities, I think, with all of the colleagues here, to put the privilege and the space to work to help with that. But naming it is a powerful thing.
Yes.
Joe Waters.
Thank you very much. Joe Waters, co-founder and CEO of Capita. Senator, this is really a question, I think, primarily for you. You used the phrase just a few minutes ago, the poor in this country continue to get crushed. I think that's absolutely right. But there's also been a lot of polling recently that has demonstrated that the Democratic Party and the progressive movement have become a rather college-educated, affluent political party, and the progressive movement too. I'm just curious to hear from you, particularly in this election year, how we can refocus the energy of the progressive movement, the energy of the Democratic Party, on the needs of the poor and the working class in this country as the Democratic Party becomes the least working class it's ever been.
And as you go to answer that, because I'm going to move us to close, and the gentleman over here, if you would just like to also put your question in. That, I think you had your, I want to make sure you had your hand up, but I'll call on you anyhow. But then we'll get a chance for closing comments from everybody. Just want to put your...
Sure. My question real quick. I'm Derek Perry. I'm with the Mighty Corporation, and I am really interested in how we affect change quickly. Essentially, my business is enterprise transformation, and I help the government do that. But when people are denying critical race theory and teaching of history and having a second truth, so to speak, how do you convince people the importance of the things that Dr. King strived for? How do we help fix the disinformation that's going on?
Great. So one coming from the private sector, one really going into policy and politics. And I will kick it to you first to respond to either or both questions and your closing thought.
My friend Brian Stevenson, who's an incredible leader, talks about proximity. And I've been thinking a lot about that, particularly over the last few days as we move into this season when we think about Dr. King. I think proximity is just an important characteristic of principled leadership. You've got to be among the people. And I think I said this the night I was elected, that you can't serve the people if you can't see the people. And so you've got to know the people and love the people and walk among the people. And you won't always have an easy answer. Often you won't. But this willingness to be among the people. I'm proud of the fact that I flipped the United States Senate when I won. And
you flipped them.
As a result of that, elections have consequences. As a result of that, we had a reconciliation bill, first big bill in my tenure in the 117th Congress. So that means these are all Democrats. And in that bill, the American Rescue Plan, we passed something called the Expanded Child Tax Credit. You know, I was on board coming as an Ascend fellow.
I know. I do you as a child care manager.
And literally, without that legislation, some people were too poor to get it.
Yeah.
So we expanded the child tax credit, which would cut child poverty 40 to 50% in this country. Now, the sad news is we were only able to do it for 6 months. And I, among others, all Democrats, Michael Bennet of Colorado, Senator Brown of Ohio, Booker of Jersey, and Warnock, we were leading the fight, trying to get our colleagues to extend it, make it permanent. How do you cut child poverty 40 to 50% and then double it the next year? And so I remain committed to that. There are other things that we're doing as well. But Dr. King saw this clearly. He saw that we could not have a robust war on poverty in our own country because we were too busy waging war against the poor, he said, of Vietnam. And so that continues to inspire me. And here's the thing that I've come to believe. We don't suffer from a poverty of resources. When you start talking about helping the poor, people say, where's the money coming from? And it's interesting, you know, when you talk about the folks who say that they're deficit hawks, I mean, the deficit tends to go up when Republicans are in office. We don't suffer from a poverty of resources, but a poverty of imagination and commitment.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Senator Reverend Warnock. And Jonathan, I want to, you know, on behalf of everybody here, and all of the Ascend Fellows are receiving a copy of the book, so we'll be having a special moderated conversation. We'll welcome you back. But I want to thank you. I think we all want to thank you for what you poured in to really help us keep looking at history, but also looking at an extraordinary human who was a human. And I think for a lot of folks here, I know are really swinging for the heart, for the fences. And you feel the weight when you read the book.
Thank you.
And when I think about my friend Dr. Ellis's history as prologue, and then we think about future as provocative provocative possibility, curious, as you've been out there in closing, if this resonates, you've been talking to so many different audiences. In those conversations, what have you gleaned from young people, from wherever, that maybe give you hope for the future as a result of your book?
That's a great question. And it's been really interesting to me to see how people are still eager to connect with King and to connect with the human King, the flawed King. I was worried, to be honest, that people might not want to hear about the King who was imperfect. But what really amazes me and what gives me hope in it, and it also reminds me of what made King special in the first place, is that he had this amazing ability to speak to broad audiences, diverse audiences, with the same words. And I think it's rooted from his belief that we're all made in the image of God, that God didn't see distinctions between us. So when he stands up and speaks, he's addressing perhaps, a room full of women and men who are walking to work because they're not taking the buses in Montgomery, but he also knows that these words are carrying to the Southern oppressors who are trying to maintain segregation, to the white Northern media, to white liberals who might support his cause. They're the same words, and he believes that those words can connect with everyone. And I think that's partly why the book connects with people, if I may, brag a little bit. I'm thrilled that the book seems to be resonating in the way that King's voice, in a small way, in some sliver of a way that King's voice resonated once, because I think we need to hear his words again.
Yeah. Amen.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again, Jonathan, Raphael, all of you, for joining the conversation, and most importantly, being part of leading the change. And the change happens every day. It happens in small ways, often happens when nobody's looking. Sometimes they're the most powerful times. But each act, each intention, each solution adds up. You said this when they were bringing you to Ebenezer. I'm not here to fill anyone's shoes. I'm standing on shoulders. For me, lead like you are not going to even be in the room or nearby. We need to lead and live our principles and our purpose and recognize our power that we each have. It's different, but it's real. And lead with that bigger sense. It helps some of the weight fall away and also feel more connected, because we can only get through it together. Thank you, everybody.
Fantastic.
Oh
Thank
my
you.
God, I can have you going.